Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast for Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope you again had a great week. Mine was so. I can't say it was the greatest week. Certainly busy as we're in training season, and I had some medical stuff to deal with. So thankfully that's all working out well. But nevertheless, busy time. I'm sure that many of you, of course, are busy during this spring season as well. So hope that you're going to be safe and that you're making a lot of money. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the podcast, ring the bell, and if you could put down just a few comments about what your thoughts are on the podcast, that would certainly be helpful as well. For those of you that don't want to deal with YouTube, I post my podcast on Rumble as well. Would love to hear your comments as well personally. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts about shows, questions that you may have, even criticisms. Yeah, we'll take criticism as well. It's you can't get better if you're not learning what you're doing wrong or ways to improve. So sure, we'll take those as well. If you have suggestions for shows, perhaps you'd want to be on a show or a guest on a show, definitely reach out to me as well, and we can make arrangements about what you want to talk about. So we'd love to hear from you. I received a question a little while back about someone wanted to get a hold of a technical person in the area of vultures. Now, I have no personal experience with vultures. I've been able to take some pictures of a vulture roost, but where I lived and when I was in business, vultures really weren't an issue, but their numbers seem to be either growing or perhaps my awareness of it's growing. I do believe their numbers are increasing and their range is expanding for certain species. So they are becoming a little bit more of a concern for some of you. Certainly not going to be a primary project for you, but it's like these niche things that you're going to start when you have the problem or you have a client with the problem. It can be certainly an issue. So I can't say this is certainly going to affect the vast majority of the audience here. Nevertheless, for those of you that have issues or clients that have problems with vultures, this is a podcast that will help you navigate that particular space. And I would just remind people, there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily deal with in our businesses and our lives, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't learn about them, because you never know when something's going to pop up. One of the things about creativity and education is that when you're learning things outside of your sphere or outside of your discipline, it helps you find connections in a new way to see things. And sometimes what it takes, I remember the late Alan Hewitt, who said, if he pays $20 for a book on business and finds one tip, then it was worth the $20. And he got it. He was a pretty successful businessman, as many of you well know. But nevertheless, he's certainly on to something there, and I would certainly concur with his conclusion. I think sometimes we think, how is this going to help me right now? And we tend to get a little narrow-focused in that regard. But nevertheless, I received this question. I was able to help this individual out. And I thought, well, why don't we do a podcast on vultures? Okay, so this is going to be relatively brief, but we're going to have a little introduction to it. Maybe I can do a deeper dive later on, but they say, oh, Stephen, there's such a niche field. Well, remember, this is the Pest Geek podcast, so we do get a little geeky here. We do get out into the more extreme things, because how much more can we talk about raccoons, right? Or rats. Sometimes you just want something a little different, but definitely comment, and I'd love to hear from you. But we're going to talk today about vultures, so let me get started here. Vultures, all right, there we go. Going to talk a little about vultures. All right, the first thing we got to talk about when we're dealing with vultures is they are a federally protected bird. So I have a whole podcast on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so I would just refer you to them. But just in sort of a summary of it, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a international treaty that the United States made. I mean, this is passed through the Senate. Those of you familiar with federal house, how treaties work, they have to be approved through the Senate. In other words, the executive branch makes these negotiations with foreign countries, and if they are approved by the Senate, then they become a full-on treaty. A lot of our agreements with other countries do not become full-on treaties. They're just sort of agreements from the executive branch, but a treaty is pretty substantive because it has to go through the upper house, right? So the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, I think it was done in 1916 between Mexico, United States, Canada. It has since been amended and is now included, I believe, Japan and Russia. So it's a pretty serious bird. And what it basically does is it protects birds that cross international boundaries. And just as a rule of thumb, all native birds to the United States are essentially protected under this Migratory Bird Treaty Act, except for those that are regulated under hunting season. So Canada goose, for example, is considered a migratory bird. Obviously, it's crossing borders, it's flying up into Canada and what have you. But there is strict regulation over its population numbers, and with other ducks and aquatic fowl. And the reason for this treaty, of course, was to prevent one country from so devastating the population that other countries couldn't participate and use that particular resource. So it is a very positive event. It's really a huge step forward for wildlife conservation. And I'm glad we have it. However, like every good thing, there's always a downside. So for those of you suffering, or for those of you who have clients who are suffering from vulture damage, it is certainly an impediment because you can't just go out and shoot it, right? So this is a problem. Your states or provinces or municipalities may have additional regulations. In fact, so states will often reinforce what's there at the federal level. The reason why I say this, because if you are ultimately going to go for a depredation permit, you not only have to get federal permission, which is its own process. Again, I've talked about that process in a previous podcast, but you may also have to obtain state permits as well. So definitely keep that process in mind. And I would just encourage people, read up, make the phone calls, learn the process before you need it, because it can be, when you're under some stress with a client or something, it can be a bit frustrating. So I would encourage you to download the material, maybe listen to my podcast, know what the process is, and have a little file folder or a folder on your desktop where you're going to have this material and links so that you don't have to be scrambling around for it when the time comes, because these things never come at convenient times. All right, enough about the legalities. So no lethal control of these birds without a permit. You're not going to be allowed to kill their eggs or disturb their nests that are going to be occupied. Okay, so however, you are allowed to haze them. Okay, so you just can't kill them, and you cannot cause injury to them or their young, okay, or the clutch. All right, so we basically have two vultures in the United States that are of a concern. Now, we have other vultures, like the condor, for example. That is a vulture, but of course that's an endangered species, so you don't want to be messing with that, and it's not really causing a damage problem. Okay, there's just not enough of them. Black vultures are a significant issue, and these are really the bullies in the vulture world. I'm going to call them bullies because they are involved in a lot of animal attacks, particularly for those people raising livestock. And during the calving time, and where with sheep, and they can be kind of predatory in this particular regard. Now, certainly they're going to feed on animals that are dead, but animals that are weak, they can attack as well. And they kind of have a little bit of a social capability to them, so they can kind of gang up on things, because when one vulture finds something, other black vultures are going to move in. But you can see the key facts here about them. They are actually smaller than the turkey vulture. We don't have black vultures up here in Montana, and we'll give you some of the range of the black vulture here. The black vulture, I didn't put it up. My apologies. So I need to put that range in. But let me see if I can pull up the image here, and I forgot to put that in. Silly me. So let me try to grab that here. Sorry for the dead air, but I'm just taking care of this particular oversight. I thought I put them in, but I clearly did not. So that was certainly a mistake on my part. Hey, it happens. What can I say? Other than I'm human at this point. So, all right. So let's deal with, let's pull this back up then. So there is the range of the turkey, excuse me, not the turkey vulture, of the black vulture. This is the black vulture range, and this is where they are year-round. So you can see they're really kind of tied to those of you down in the southeastern portion of the United States. There is a little finger that comes down out into, I believe that's Arizona. And so you will get some down there, but my understanding is that their range is creeping north a little bit more. And those of you up in the middle states like Tennessee and maybe even portions of certainly Kentucky, looks like a lot of Kentucky has got black vultures as well. So really just the lower third or quarter of the United States in the southeast region has these black vultures. Well, the other vulture we have, of course, is the turkey vulture. I like the turkey vulture. I just think they're a neat bird. They got that red head. Black vultures have a black head, and the turkey vulture also has these sort of gray underneath the wings that the black vulture doesn't have. So black vulture's pretty much mostly black. It's got a little coloration, but it's kind of some grayish there. But the turkey vulture has a little bit more color. It's the red head, and then of course white underneath its wings as well. So turkey vulture is a lot bigger, 5 to 5.7 to 6 feet in terms of its wingspan, and it weighs a little bit more, 3.5 to 4.4 pounds. And, as a bigger bird, it doesn't have to flap as frequently as the black vulture does. And where the black vulture likes to focus more toward wet habitats, along riparian areas or lakes, turkey vulture just, has a little bit more flexibility in that regard. So, and turkey vultures, like all vultures, they like to roost high, because they got, they'll check things out and look around the world. Well, there's the range of the turkey vulture. You can see how it is significantly larger than the black vulture. The black vulture is tied to the southeastern portion of the United States primarily, where the turkey vulture almost covers the entire continental U.S. with some gaps out in the plains and some upper upper Montana. But, I can tell you right now that map is a little off because we have, where I'm looking where I live in Montana, we have turkey vultures up here. So I see them around. Not a lot, to be sure, but we do have them around. So that's the problem with smudge maps, is they're never perfect, but it kind of gives you an idea that the turkey vulture is almost nationwide in terms of its range. But typically it's going to be just in the summer. Otherwise, it's during the wintertime, it's going to migrate back down to those warmer climates along the coast of California, and then, of course, the black vulture areas, so they will probably commingle in their cross area down there. What kind of damage do these birds do? Well, they can do a lot. So they will tear things up. You can see this little picture here of a vulture grabbing some tile on a roof and breaking it. They will scratch things. They will gouge things. I think I've heard stories of birds coming up to peeling off rubber off of roofs and this sort of thing. So it can be quite annoying. Plus the excrement, right? These birds can crap out a lot. It's because they congregate, and the whitewash and the ammonia smell. And one article I read said there's even, with clients that have these problems, there's even the sense of doom. So it's like, the black crow thing, where the birds are there, and it's like you just feel like there's just death in the air, probably. So this sense of doom. And so that's important for those of you in the field to think about, that when your client is struggling with vultures, understand there's a psychological and emotional aspect to this. So you need to be sensitive to the pain that your client is experiencing. So be sure you're on your best emotional intelligence ability. So sometimes when we're in the field, we get a little task oriented, and we need to kind of hold our client's hand, figuratively speaking, while they're struggling with this particular problem. So let's talk about control briefly here. Well, habitat modification is important. So let's talk about food, all right? So if we can eliminate food, is it going to solve the problem? The answer is no. Okay, it's not going to solve the problem, but it helps. Because obviously, if a bird doesn't have food, it's not going to hang around as long, right? And so we want to be sure that people are managing their waste and trash and garbage appropriately. For those of you in more agricultural areas, it's going to be important for you to try to get your ranchers, your livestock people, to be sure that they are calving, perhaps under cover. That's going to be particularly important for your black vultures, but also for the, things like afterbirth and any downed livestock. That's just going to be, again, another attractant for these birds, because that's what they are. They're scavengers, and so they know they've been designed to ferret out dead animals and sick animals and feed on them as part of the recycling that's part of our ecosystem. So this would also, you kind of wonder as well, with the amount of deer that get hit on vehicles on our roads and highways in the United States, where this is maybe one of the reasons why these vultures are doing so well, perhaps with the roadkill that's out there, that's giving them a constant supply of food that would be more than usual in the landscape. Now, how about situations where the birds are roosting in trees? Is there any evidence that suggests that tree thinning will help move them along? The article I read said that it would likely help, but there are no clear standards. Those of you that may have heard me speak about other roosting birds like starlings that are in trees, that there seems to be the notion that if you can trim up to a third of the canopy of a tree, that actually opens it up and makes it less attractive to these birds to roost in. So that's what I would only suggest perhaps with vultures, but you need to be sure that your client understands that tree thinning, that those thinning out the branches may not be sufficient to drive them away, where that seems to have worked for other birds that are congregating in tighter areas, because of course, starlings can be in the hundreds and hundreds, where you typically don't get that with vultures. You can get a lot, but not you're not getting hundreds to thousands of vultures in one particular area. At least I haven't heard it. If you've heard about it, I would love to hear from you, because I think that would be quite interesting. And I would just simply add as a side point here, and that is if the tree branch thinning is going to be done, make sure it's done properly, because there's certain ways to cut. There's the right way to cut off a branch so that the tree has the best chance to heal. And so make sure if you're doing that for the client, you understand how that is done and that your equipment is clean, because if you're doing it with multiple trees, you could be spreading disease from one tree to another through this particular process. So it may be something you want to hand off to an arborist or something like that, someone who has some experience and knowledge about doing it correctly. Not that it's rocket science, it's not, but it's certainly something you want to be sure that when you're already putting that kind of stress on a tree, you want to be sure that you're not adding a disease component and not doing it properly to give that tree the best chance to survive. So, of course, there's always the cutting the tree down, so that has to be considered as well. But typically most clients aren't looking to do that because trees are just such a valuable resource and it takes so long to grow. So what about situations where the birds are roosting on structures, where these vultures are on structures? Well, the research seems to suggest that you don't want to use tall, thin spikes that are spaced, because the birds will actually bend them down, which is kind of weird. That's a little unusual to hear. So they actually bend them down and then nest on it and continue to roost. So don't use the spikes that you see on the left-hand side. What the research said is that you want to use spikes that are short, sharp, and tightly spaced. And the only thing I could think of that would be close to that would be Nixolite. And so if you can think of other products out there that are similar to Nixolite, because they're short, they're sharp, and they're tightly spaced. So that's not doing an endorsement here of Nixolite. I'm just, in the article didn't mention Nixolite by name, but that's the only ledge product I could think of that was common, I guess. I probably should phrase it that way. That was common, that I could think of. There might be others, but if you're using spikes, make sure it's not like the spikes you see on the left, which are widely spaced, that are really more for pigeons rather than for other birds. The article did mention that you need to really think about electric track. It kind of spoke a little highly of electric track as a really good means. Why? Because there's a pain response, right? And so that should become as no surprise to most of you in the wildlife control industry. Electric track has really been revolutionary to the field of bird control, because it works and it has a low profile and it's easy to install. I've heard that if you're getting out to longer distances, it's actually cheaper to use electric track, not because electric track is cheaper by the foot, but it's cheaper in terms of its installation time. That is, whenever you're thinking about installing a particular product, you have to be thinking about not just what the materials cost, but also what the labor costs. And typically, labor is significantly higher as a cost to the client than the product. So if you can use a more expensive product that saves you time, then you can pass that savings on to the client and have something that's easier for you to deal with, right? So they said that, after you get out to 50 to 100 feet or so, the shock track or the electric track actually is cheaper on a total cost basis. But again, you kind of need those long lines to really do that, because otherwise, if you're dealing with a lot of bends and folds, then obviously that might change it. But think about the total cost, not just simply the equipment cost, when you're looking at your equipment used for managing birds. So electric track is certainly something you can use. Solar, you can plug them in, and so there's a lot of benefits with that, and it'll keep those vultures off those particular ledges. They also talked, interestingly enough, about the coyote roller. You say, why are we talking about the coyote roller? Well, the coyote roller was for situations where you have birds roosting on a particular spot. You can use the coyote roller because they can't stand on it, because it will it will spin and they'll fall off. and they recommended it as an option to keep birds from perching on particular locations. So if you're the owner of Coyote Roller, then you have a whole new market for your particular work. Maybe you need to have a vulture roller and rebrand. Effigies, these are getting into frightening devices, so vulture effigies have been found to be extraordinarily effective on driving vultures away from unwanted areas. Interestingly, they don't seem to habituate to the effigy, which is absolutely fascinating. You may know that, how many times have you seen an owl on someone's house and there's a pigeon on top of it, right? That's called habituation. The pigeons realize over time that this is not an object that moves. It's not a real owl. I don't have to be afraid of it. I'm just going to go crap on it. Vultures, for some reason, don't seem to recognize that the vulture effigy is not real. So it doesn't seem that they've learned to live with it. So the challenge, of course, is with vulture effigies is the vulture is a migratory bird species. So you have to have a permit to possess the bird to use it as an effigy. And so this has been a huge barrier for using these effigies, because you have to have a vulture that is dead, and you have to get in order to use it, even if it died, it got hit by a truck, it died of natural causes, you're picking that bird up and possessing it is a violation of federal law. Even holding a feather is a violation of federal law, right? So this is serious. So how are you going to use it? How are you going to get an effigy? So you have to get a permit, and it's not easy. It's a little bit of a hassle, assuming you'll even get approved to have the permit, right? So by the time you get all that, the bird that you have is already decayed out because you can't hold it in a freezer while you're waiting for a response. It's a mess. I mean, this is something the industry really should work on. But of course, I'm going into one of my hobby horses. Of course, the industry won't, because it's hard and it requires work and there are funner things to do. But I digress. So do you have to have so if you do have an effigy, does it matter whether the wings are open or partially closed or wings fully closed? And the answer is essentially, it doesn't appear so. At least when they were used to drive away birds from areas where planes were living. So it didn't seem to matter to that researcher. What they do say, however, is you want the vulture effigy to be high. You want it to be very visible for the other vultures. And vultures are high soaring birds, so you want it as high as you can get it. And so make sure you're following all safety requirements. Don't just climb up towers on your own. You may need to get permission to get up there, and you want to have it away from the structure so that it doesn't become entangled. That's very important as well, because it's going to blow in the wind. So you want to be sure things are as secure as possible. So when people had these taxidermied, they don't last forever. They kind of wear out, right? So this has been a problem. So the question was ultimately raised, can you make artificial effigies? And the answer is yes. Artificial effigies, these are, basically plastic or fake feathers or whatever the case may be, they work too, which is awesome. The problem is that they seem to be difficult locating, at least recently, because let me pull up this little section online for you here. And so you can do a search for Amazon.com vulture effigy, which I did, but this is more of a doll, so that's not really helpful. How about this one? It's just stuffed things here. This one's probably a little bit better, but notice it's out of stock. So if we went over to this other one from Walmart, here's one. This is, of course, the doll. We don't want the doll, but this artificial black vulture taxidermied object. Again, it's artificial, but it looks pretty real. and it's actually not a black vulture. It's actually a turkey vulture because it has a red head. But nevertheless, it's out of stock. See, these come from China, it appears, and so there seems to be a problem right now as to whether they're available. And then I looked at this one was the flock-free vulture effigy, $100 for it. It is available. I went down and looked at some of the comments, and they weren't kind, to be quite frank about it. So they were not kind. So I don't know if this particular vulture effigy from Flock Free is effective or not. I can't speak to that. I haven't seen any research. I do know that artificial effigies, I believe, if memory serves, that they said you want it as realistic as possible. However, but within limits. I mean, I showed you a picture of this one from the artificial black vulture, although it's not a black vulture, it's a turkey vulture, so Walmart needs to change that. That this would probably be sufficient for you. It's something certainly what, but the problem is, of course, it's out of stock. So maybe this is something, a business opportunity for one of you to get out if you can find a source for these artificial vultures. Maybe this is a space that you can go into. I would love to get comments on the flock-free vulture if they think this is going to be effective. I know, and I'm looking at it, kind of in some ways looks the neck's a little long. It kind of has a little crow-like look to it, but maybe it's bigger than it actually appears. But nevertheless, I would love to get feedback on the flock-free vulture if people have found that to be effective, because it is available and it's probably worth a shot. Because there's not a lot else you can do. Now, you can use pyrotechnics if you have if it's safe in your particular area. Don't forget to contact law enforcement and make sure the birds aren't hurt, and that your neighbors aren't going to be screaming, because people get really wired up when you're shooting pyrotechnics. Of course, you got to watch about fire danger, so there's a lot of things to keep in mind. So that is an option, but it's often not going to be that. You're not going to be able to use it in most situations. So the effigy is really the way to go. So let me get back to my slide here. And so here was the one that was pictured in the article, and that's Avery and Lowney 2016. In their suggestion, my interpretation of it is that this is the kind of artificial vulture that would work. I want to read more, and because I was giving you essentially a summary of this particular publication along with some other things, but this was the primary source of my talk today, and that is, for those of you who are driving, that's Avery and Lowney, Lowney, 2016, Vultures in the Wildlife Damage Management Technical Series, Fort Collins, Colorado. So if you do a search for vultures with Avery, Avery, and Lowney, Lwney, this publication will come up, and you can see the URL in the screen as well if you want to go directly to it. And that will basically go through in a little bit more detail than what I have here, but you're seeing the high points. A lot of you are able to connect the dots about other things, but those are the materials that will work on vultures, and hopefully you're able to help your client, or at least start, because you're going to have to go through all this before you're going to get permission to do a depredation permit if you're going to go to a lethal control element. And that's going to be a little hard, and there's a cost to that as well, especially for private people. It's going to be $100. So, and there's no guarantee they'll give you permission. So definitely think about that. Well, this is I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. I do hope you take a few moments to subscribe to the channel. Drop me a line at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And if you can also find me on Rumble, I post these podcasts up on Rumble for those of you that don't want to deal with YouTube. And of course, I would love to hear from you if you have ideas for future shows or comments on this particular show. It's great to hear from you again. Primarily, I like to hear things through email rather than through Facebook. You can also join our Facebook community on with the Pest Geek podcast family. You can certainly communicate there, but I'm not a big fan of messaging, if at all possible. So reach out to me through my email. I do check my email, and it allows me to respond in a better manner. Because a lot of times people are asking complex questions, and typing it on a phone is not sufficient because people think the question is simple, and there's very few things in wildlife control that are just simple because there's a lot more involved, and I don't know your level of expertise, and so there's liability issues involved as well. So email is definitely the way to go. Well, thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Living the Wildlife. And why do they call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.